Hello and welcome to A Short Story Scene. I'm your host, the storyteller, and here we have a tale called The Monkey's Paw by W.W. Jacobs. Without the night was cold and wet, but in a small parlor of Libranium Villa, the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were at chess, the former, who possessed ideas about the game involving radical changes, putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary perils that even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady knitting placidly by the fire. "Hark at the wind," said Mr. White, who was having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing his son from seeing it. "I'm listening," said the latter, grimly surveying the board as he stretched out his hand. "Check. I should hardly think that he'd come tonight," said his father with his hand poised over the board. "Mate," replied his son. "That's the worst of the living so far out," bawled Mr. White, with a sudden unlooked for violence. "Of all the beastly slushies out of the way places to live in, this is the worst. Pathways a bog and the roads a torrent. I don't know what people are thinking about. I suppose because only 2 houses on the road are let, they think it doesn't matter." "Never mind, dear," said his wife soothingly. "Perhaps you'll win the next one." Mr. White looked up sharply just in time to intercept the knowing glance between mother and son. The words died away on his lips when he hid a guilty grin in his thin gray beard. "There he is," said Hubert White, as the gate banged so loudly the heavy footsteps came toward the door. The old man rose with hospitable haste, and opening the door, was heard condoling with the new arrival, and the new arrival also condoled with himself, so that Mrs. White said, "Tut, tut," and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man, beady of eye and rubicund of visage. "Sergeant Major Morris," he said, introducing himself, and the sergeant major shook hands, taking the proffered seat by the fire, watched contentedly while his host got out his whiskey and tumblers and stood a small copper kettle on the fire. At the third glass his eye got brighter, and he began to talk, a little family circle regarding with eager interest this visitor from distant parts, as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of a strange scene, dotty deeds of wars and plagues and strange people. 21 years of it," said Mr. White, nodding to his wife and son. "When he went away he was a slip of a youth in the warehouse. Now look at him. He don't look to have taken much harm," said Mrs. White politely. "I'd like to go to India myself," said the old man, "just to look around a bit, you know." "Better where you are," said the sergeant major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass and sighed softly, shook it again. "I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and jugglers," said the old man. "What was that you started telling me the other day about the monkey's paw or something, Morris?" "Nothing," said the soldier hastily. "Leastways, nothing worth hearing." "Monkey paw?" said Mrs. White curiously. "Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps," said Sergeant Major offhandedly. His 3 listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor absent-mindedly put his empty glass to his lips, then set it down again. His host filled it for him. "To look at," said the sergeant major, fumbling on his pockets, "is just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy." He took something out of his pocket and proffered it to Mrs. White, drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. "And what is there special about it?" inquired Mr. White, as he took it from his son, and having examined it, placed it upon the table. "It had a spell put on it by an old fakir," said the sergeant major, "a very holy man. He wanted to show his faith ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it. His manner was so impressive that his hearers were conscious that their light laughter jarred somewhat. Well, why don't you have 3, sir? Said Hubert White cleverly. The soldier regarded him in a way that middle age is wont to regard presumptuous youth. I have, he said quietly, and his blotchy face whitened. And did you really have the 3 wishes granted? Asked Mrs. White. I did, said the sergeant major, and his glass tipped against his strong teeth. And has anybody else wished? Inquired the old lady. The first man had his 3 wishes, yes, was the reply. I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw. His tones were so grave that the hush fell over the group. If you had your 3 wishes, it's not good to you now, then, Morris, said the old man at last. What do you keep it for? The soldier shook his head. Fancy, I suppose, he said slowly. If I could have another 3 wishes, said the old man, eyeing him keenly, would you have them? I don't know, said the other. I don't know. He took the paw and dangling it between his front finger and thumb and suddenly threw it upon the fire. White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off. Better let it burn, said the soldier solemnly. If you don't want it, Morris, said the old man, give it to me. I won't, said his friend doggedly. I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it on the fire again like a sensible man. The other shook his head and examined his new possession closely. How do you do it? He inquired. Hold it in your right hand and wish aloud, said the sergeant major, but I warn you of the consequences. Sounds like the Arabian Nights, said Mrs. White, and she rose and began to set the supper. Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me? Her husband drew the talisman from his pocket, and then all 3 burst into laughter as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm. If you must wish, he said gruffly, wish for something sensible. Mr. White dropped it back into his pocket and, placing chairs, motioned for his friend to the table. In the business of supper, the talisman was partially forgotten, and afterwards the 3 sat, listened in an enthralled fashion to the second installment of the soldier's adventures in India. If the tale about the monkey paw is not more truthful than those he has been telling us, said Hubert, as the door closed behind their guest just in time for him to catch the last train, we shan't make much of it. Did you give him anything for it, father? Inquired Mrs. White, regarding her husband closely. A trifle, he said, coloring slightly. He didn't want it, but I made him take it, and he pressed me again to throw it away. Likely, said Hubert, with a pretending horror. Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. Wish to be the emperor father to begin with. Then you can't be henpecked. He darted around the table, pursued by the maligned Mrs. White, armed with an antimacassar. Mr. White took a paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously. I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact, he said slowly. It seems to me I've got all I want. If you only cleared the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you? Said Hubert with his hand on his shoulder. Well, wish for £200, then. That'll just do it. His father, smiling shamefacedly at his own credulity, held up the talisman, as his son, with a solemn face somewhat marred by a wink at his wife, sat down at the piano and struck a few impressive chords. I wish for £200, said the old man distinctly. A fine crash from the piano greeted the words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran toward him. It moved, he cried, with a glance of disgust at the object as it lay on the floor. As I wished, it twisted in my hands like a snake. Well, I don't see the money, said his son, and he picked up and placed it on the table. I bet I never shall. It must have been your fancy, father, said his wife, regarding him anxiously. He shook his head. Never mind, though, there's no harm done, but it gave me a shock all the same. They sat down by the fire again, while the 2 men finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was higher than ever, and the old man stared nervously at the sound of the door banging upstairs. A silence unusual and depressing settled upon all three. They listened until the old couple rose to retire for the night. "I expect you'll find cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed," said Hubert, as he bade them good night, "and something horrible squatting up on top of the wardrobe watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains." He sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire and seeing faces in it. The last face was horrible and so simian that he gazed at it in amazement. I got so vivid. With a little uneasy laugh, he felt as the table for the glass and containing a little water to throw over it. His hand grasped the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver he wiped his hand on the coat and went up to bed. In the brightest of wintry sun next morning, as it streamed over the breakfast table, Hubert laughed at his fears. There was an air of prosaic wholesomeness about the room which it had lacked the previous night, and a dirty, shriveled little paw was pitched on the sideboard with a carelessness which betokened no great belief in virtues. "I suppose all the old soldiers are the same," said Mrs. White. "An idea of listening to such nonsense. How could wishes be granted in these days? And if they could, how did £100 hurt you, father?" "Might drop on his head from the sky," said the frivolous Hubert. "Morris said that things happen so naturally," said his father, "that you might, if you so wished, attribute it to coincidence." "Well, don't break it into money before I come back," said Hubert, as he rose from the table. "I'm afraid it'll turn you into a mean, avaricious man, and we shall have to disown you." His mother laughed, and following him to the door, watched him down the road, and returning to the breakfast table, was very happy at the expense of his father's credulity, all of which did not prevent her from scurrying to the door at the postman's knock, nor prevent her from referring somewhat shortly to retired sergeant majors of bibulous habits when she found that the post brought a tailor's bill. "Hubert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home," she said, as they sat at dinner. "I dare say," said Mr. White, pouring himself out some beer, "but for all that, the thing that moved in my hand, that I swear to." "You thought it did," said the old lady soothingly. "I say it did," replied the other. "There was no thought about it. I had just— What's the matter?" His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of the old man outside, who was peering in an undecided fashion at the house, appearing to be trying to make up his mind to enter, in a mental connection with the £200. She noticed that the stranger was well dressed and wore a silk hat and glossy newsness. 3 times he paused at the gate, and then he walked on again. The 4th time he stood there with his hand upon it. Then, with a sudden resolution, flung it open and walked up the path. Mrs. White at the same moment placed her hands behind her and hurried unfastening the strings of her apron, put the useful article of apparel beneath the cushions of her chair. She brought the stranger, who seemed ill at ease, in the room. He gazed at her fervently and listened in a preoccupied fashion as the old lady apologized for the appearance of the room and her husband's coat, a garment which he usually reserved for the garden. She then waited patiently for her sex would permit, and him to broach his business, but he was at first strangely silent. "I was asked to call," he said at last, and stooped and picked a piece of cotton from his trousers. "I came from Ma Megan's." The old lady started. "Is anything the matter?" she asked breathlessly. "Has anything happened to Hubert? What is it? What is it?" Her husband interposed. Their mother," he said hesitantly. "Sit down. I don't jump to conclusions. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir." He eyed the other wistfully. "I'm sorry," began the visitor. "Is he hurt?" demanded the mother. The visitor bowed in assent. "Badly hurt," he said quietly, "but he is not in any pain. Oh, thank God, said the old lady, clasping her hands. Thank God for that. She broke off suddenly, as the sinister meaning of the assurance dawned upon her, and that she saw an awful confirmation in her fears in the other's averant face. She caught her breath and, turning to her slowly witted husband, laid her trembling old hand upon him. There was a long silence. He was caught in the machinery, said the visitor at length in a low voice. Caught in the machinery, replied Mr. White, in a dazed fashion. Yes? He sat staring blankly out the window and taking his wife's hand between his own, pressing it as he had wont to do with the old courting days nearly 40 years before. He was the only one left to us, he said, turning gently to the visitor. It is hard. The other coughed and, rising, walked slowly to the window. The firm wished me to convey their sincere sympathies with you to your great loss, he said, without looking around. I beg that you will understand I am only their servant and merely obeying orders. There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring, her breath inaudible. On the husband's face was a look of such as his friend and sergeant might have carried into his first action. I was to say that the Meggings disclaimed all responsibility, continued the other. They admitted no liability at all, but in consideration of your son's services, they wished to present you with a certain sum of compensation. Mr. White dropped his wife's hand and, rising to his feet, gazed with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the words, "How much?" £200 was the answer. Unconsciously of his wife's shriek, and the old man smiled faintly, put out his hand like a sightless man, and dropped the senseless heap to the floor. In a huge new cemetery some 2 miles distant, the old people buried their dead, and came back to the house steeped in the shadow of silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly realize it, and remained in this state of expectation as though of something else to happen, something else which was to lighten this load, too heavy for old hearts to bear. But the days passed, and the expectation gave place to resignation, the hopeless resignation of old, sometimes miscalled apathy. Sometimes they hardly exchanged a word, for now they had nothing to talk about. Their days were long to weariness. It was about a week after that the old man, waking suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. The room was in darkness, and the sound of subdued weeping came from the window. He raised himself in the bed and listened. "Come back," he said tenderly. "You will be cold." "It's colder for my son," said the old woman, and wept afresh. The sound of her sobs died away on his ears. The bed was warm and his eyes heavy with sleep. He dozed fitfully, and then slept until a sudden wild cry from his wife awoke him with a start. "The paw!" she cried wildly. "The monkey's paw!" She stared up with alarm. Where is it? What's the matter?" She came stumbling across the room towards him. "I want it," she said quietly. "You are not to destroy it?" "It's in the parlor on the bracket," he replied, marveling. "Why?" She cried and laughed together, and bending over, kissed his cheek. "I only just thought of it," she said hysterically. Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it?" "Think of what?" he questioned. "The other 2 wishes," she replied rapidly. "We've only had one." "Was not that enough?" he demanded furiously. "No," she cried triumphantly. "We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly, and wish our boy alive again." The man sat up in bed and flung the bedclothes from his quaking limbs. "Good God, you're mad!" he cried, exhausted. "Get it," she panted. "Get it quickly and wish. Oh, my boy, my boy." Her husband struck a match and lit a candle. "Get back to bed," he said unsteadily. "You don't know what you're saying." "We had the first wish granted," said the old woman feverishly. "Why not the second?" "A coincidence," stammered the old man. "Go and get it and wish," cried the old woman, quivering with excitement. The old man turned and regarded her. His voice shook. "He has been dead 10 days, and besides I would not tell you else, but I could only recognize him by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to see then, how now?" "Bring him back," she cried, the old woman, and dragging him toward the door. "Do you think I fear the child I have nursed?" He went down into the darkness and felt his way to the parlor, and then to the mantelpiece. The talisman was in its place. The horrible fear that the unspoken wish might bring his mutilated son before him ere he could escape from a room seized upon him, and he caught his breath and found that he had lost the direction of the door. His brow cold with sweat, he felt his way around the table and groped along the wall until he found himself in a small passage with the unwholesome thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed to change as he entered the room. It was white and expectant, and to his fears seemed to have an unnatural look upon it. He was afraid of her. "Wish," she cried in a strong voice. "It is foolish and wicked," he faltered. "Wish," she repeated, his wife, and he raised his hand. "I wish my son alive again." The talisman fell to the floor, and he regarded it fearfully. Then he sank trembling into the chair as the old woman, with burning eyes, walked in the window and raised the blind. He sat until he was chilled with the cold, glancing occasionally at the figure of the old woman peering through the window. The candle end, which had burnt below the rim of the china candlestick, was throwing pulsating shadows on the ceiling and walls until, with a flickering larger than the rest, it expired. The old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, crept back into his bed, and a minute or two afterward the old woman came silently and apathetically beside him. Neither spoke, but both lay silent, listening to the ticking of the clock. A stair creaked, and the squeaking mouse scurried noisily through the wall. The darkness was oppressive, and after lying for some time screwing up his courage, the husband took the box of matches and, striking one, went downstairs for a candle. At the foot of the stairs the match went out, and he paused to strike another, and at the same moment a knock, so quiet and stealthy as to be scarcely audible, sounded on the front door. The matches fell from his hand. He stood motionless, his breath suspended until the knock was repeated. Then he turned and fled swiftly back to his room and closed the door behind him. A third knock sounded through the house. "What's that?" cried the old woman, starting up. "A rat," said the old man in shaking tones. "A rat. It passed me on the stairs." His wife sat up in the bed listening. The loud knocks resounded through the house. "It's Hubert!" she screamed. "It's Hubert!" And she ran to the door, but her husband was before her, and catching her by the arm, held her tightly. "What are you going to do?" he whispered hoarsely. "It's my boy, Herbert," she cried, struggling mechanically. "I forgot it was 2 miles away. What are you holding me for? Let go. I must open the door." "For God's sakes, don't let it in," cried the old man, trembling. "You're afraid of your own son?" she cried, struggling. "Let me go. I'm coming, Herbert, I'm coming." There was another knock and another. The old woman was a sudden wrench, broke free, and ran for the room, and her husband followed the landing and called after her appealingly as she hurried downstairs. He heard the chain rattle back at the bottom bolt, drawn slowly and stiffly from the socket. Then the old woman's voice strained and panting. "The bolt!" she cried loudly. "Come down, I can't reach it." But her husband was on his hands and knees, groping wildly on the floor in search of the paw. If he could only find it before the thing outside got in. A perfect fusillade of knocks reverberating through the house. He heard the scraping of the chair as his wife put it down in the passage against the door. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back, and at the same moment he found the monkey's paw and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking ceased suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chair drawn back and the door open. A cold wind rushed up the staircase, and a long, loud wail of disappointment and misery from his wife gave him courage to run down to her side. Then to the gate beyond. The street lamp flickered opposite shone on a quiet and deserted road. And that concludes our story, The Monkey's Paw, by W. W. Jacobs. If you like this content and would like to support it, please head on to Patreon. That is www.patreon.com/shortstoriescene. I'd like to thank Drac for being a patron. And thank you all for listening, and see you next episode. Bye.